Diddy behind bars and indicted on federal sex trafficking and racketeering allegations.
Heather Unro's tweet about Kevin Spacey last month triggered all the allegations against him.
Best-selling British author Neil Gaiman has released a statement denying he has ever engaged in non-consensual sex.
The Me Too movement brought about the cancellations, criminal convictions, and fall of many a male celebrity. When thinking of the Me Too era, while figures like Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, and R. Kelly might be who come to your mind first, it's Aziz Ansari's story that should keep you up at night. Because Aziz's story has a lot to do with all of us. How did Aziz Ansari go from wearing a Time's Up pin at the Golden Globe Awards at the height of his career to support the Me Too movement, only to end up outed as a sexual abuser himself? Well, we created him. In the year 2025, by this point, I think many people have probably heard the term rape culture at some point, but I'm not sure many people know what it means. It refers to the idea that rape and sexual abuse are commonplace and normalized in our communities, as well as media and entertainment, as the result of the community's attitudes and misunderstandings about gender, sexuality, gender roles, and sex. And I think Aziz Ansari's accuser's story perfectly illustrates how our society, our cultural understanding or misunderstanding of sex, and how we go about teaching boys and men to pursue sex, to see women, as well as how we go about teaching girls and women about sex, create scenarios where people are casually, regularly, and most importantly and insidiously, unintentionally engaging in sexually inappropriate and coercive conduct, i.e. rape culture. But before we talk about Aziz and the world that made him possible, let's first take a look at this story about the 4B movement in South Korea. More and more women are choosing this lifestyle in protest against South Korean patriarchal society. Reports also show that following Donald Trump's 2024 election, interest in the 4B movement surged among American women. You can read this article and more on Ground News, today's sponsor, and my source of research for productions like these, because not only does their app and website let you compare how the media is framing any given story worldwide and get context on each source, in this particular climate where everyone is targeting you with clickbait and misinformation, where it's hard to tell what's real, what's fake news, and what's just straight up propaganda, and maybe even AI, a tool like Ground News is invaluable, especially when I'm researching something as sensitive as the Me Too movement, the 4B movement, and the horrible things that they were created to address. Follow along at ground.news/Olay. Comparing coverage is interesting. Of the 145 sources, only 16% are right-leaning, making this a potential blind spot for that side. And when we take a look at headlines, we can see the right emphasizing language around sex and abortion rights, while the left highlights the rising interest in the US. If you scroll down, you can also see the factuality and ownership of the sources. Ground News really cannot be beat because it makes it easy for me to make sure that I am not just spewing unsubstantiated mess or being biased and trifling, which is why it was a no-brainer to go with them for today's sponsor. They are subscriber funded, so you will not see any ads on the website, which contributes to sensationalism and clickbait reporting. By subscribing, you're not only getting an amazing resource, but you're supporting their work directly and helping keep media reporting honest. Go to ground.news/Olay or scan the QR code on screen to subscribe. Ground News is giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. This deal will only be available for a limited time, so you better jump on it. Thank you for sponsoring this video, Ground News. I often see posts on social media about how rape is the one inexcusable crime that's never accidental, that's always clear-cut and black and white. Those discussions always interest me, not just as a criminal defense attorney, but more as someone who has seen reasonable minds disagree and be unable to arrive at a consensus on whether something is rape and how or whether it should be punished, because the way we think about and engage in sex in our real lives can often run in conflict with the law and consent. I remember being in my criminal law class during my first year of law school when the class erupted into debate and split opinions all over the room over whether different incidents in our casebook were rape, what the law should be as it pertained to rape, and how the laws about rape and consent didn't often reflect real life. Let me explain what I mean. Rape isn't universally defined. Different places in the country have different definitions of what rape is, what consent is, and thus what was legally considered rape and how or if it would be punished. For example, there was a Baltimore case we read that stuck with me, the State versus Rusk. The facts of the case went something like this. A woman offered a male acquaintance named Rusk a ride home. When she arrived at his home and parked to let him out, the man insisted she come inside, locked her door, and took her keys and turned her car off and demanded she go in the house or she wouldn't get her keys back. Feeling afraid and like she had no other choice, she eventually went in the house with him, but she continued to plead with him that she wanted to leave, but he told her to stay. He eventually began undressing her and kissing her while she cried, and she asked him if he would let her go without killing her if she did what he told her, and he told her that he would. So she proceeded to have sex with him because she was afraid for her life. A jury initially convicted the man of rape, but a court of appeals reversed the conviction because rape in Baltimore is considered sex by physical force or threat of physical force. And that appeals court felt that despite the situational evidence of the man taking her keys, forcing her to go inside his home, kissing and undressing her while she cried and pleaded to go home, and affirmatively recognizing that she feared for her life because she explicitly asked him if he would let her go without killing her if she did what he wanted, and him replying yes, that there wasn't sufficient evidence that he raped her because he did not actually physically force her or explicitly threaten to physically force her. Most of my class agreed that this was the wrong decision, that the woman had been raped. Most of the class agreed that a rape law that defined rape as only being rape if there was physical force was a bad one, because it leads to outcomes like the one above, where people are coerced and scared into sexual acts they do not consent to. And what's scary and worth mentioning is that this definition of rape that we're recognizing as problematic, sex by physical force without consent, is an upgrade from the old definition of rape, which was sex by force without consent and the utmost resistance, which basically meant that victims had to physically fight off their attackers for it to be considered rape, which of course would expose them to more danger and a greater likelihood of being killed. But it is also reflective of an underlying belief by the lawmakers that some level of coercion or cajoling hesitant women who were resistant into sex was normal, which is why it had to be the utmost resistance to count as rape. This is rape culture. Now, what was interesting is despite the fact that most people in my class saw that legal definition of rape as problematic because it leads to outcomes like the one above, many of those same people saw issues with rape laws designed to avoid those kinds of outcomes, like what New Jersey has. New Jersey has something called affirmative consent, which means that in New Jersey, rape isn't just sex without consent. Rape is sex without affirmative consent, meaning it doesn't make it consensual sex just because the person didn't say no or didn't explicitly not consent. They need to explicitly say yes, they want to have sex for you to have consent. Even though this law is designed to make sure there are no gray areas or confusion about whether sex is consensual or not, many people in my class pointed out that that's not how most sexual encounters happen in real life. People aren't stopping mid whatever they're doing to say, do you want to have sex? Many men in the class said that stopping foreplay or whatever they do to ask a woman explicitly whether she wanted to have sex would be a mood killer and likely cause women who wanted to have sex not to want to anymore. And both men and women in my class discussed this kind of song and dance that happens in many of our sexual experiences, where women don't want to explicitly say they want to have sex and sort of pretend to be cajoled into it. Don't worry, we're gonna get back to this. So even though there was some consensus about whether it was rape in the State versus Rusk case, that consensus was gone by the time we analyzed the Pennsylvania case called the Commonwealth versus Berkowitz. In Pennsylvania, rape is sex by force without consent. But force here doesn't mean just physical force. It means forcible compulsion, meaning that there needs to be force or some kind of threat. In the Berkowitz case, their bare-bone facts loosely go something like this. Berkowitz and the young woman he was alleged to have raped were college sophomores at the time the incident took place. What the woman alleges happened is that she went to her boyfriend's dorm lounge to meet him, but he wasn't there, so she went to his room to find him. She said that she knocked on the door several times, but no one answered, so she wrote a note to her boyfriend, then knocked again. She still received no answer, so this time she tried the doorknob, which was unlocked. She said she then went into the room and saw someone lying on the bed with a pillow over his head, and she said she thought it was her boyfriend, but it was actually his roommate Berkowitz. She said she then asked Berkowitz which dresser was her boyfriend's, and then she left the note she had written. She said Berkowitz then asked her to hang out for a while, so she did. But then Berkowitz started making certain advances at her, such as kissing her and lifting up her shirt and bra and fondling her. She said she then said no once, but they continued making out, and that eventually Berkowitz got up and locked the door. She took her own pants off and they had sex, and she never physically tried to stop or resist him, but she did say no. She then alleged that he came on her and she left the room and went to the lobby where she ran into her boyfriend, who she then told that Berkowitz raped her, and he called the police. Now, the class got really into the weeds fighting about this case, and people truly were divided. People saw the facts very differently. Some people saw Berkowitz locking the door as similar to Russ taking his victim's keys, while others argued that someone getting up to lock the door before they have sex is typical behavior, especially when you have a roommate, and an indicator that she knew they were going to have sex. Some people saw her continuing to make out with Berkowitz while saying no, but also having taken off her own pants as reflective of the fact that she didn't really mean no, but was just doing a song and dance young women and men often do. Some people argued that the woman only said it was rape because she ran into her boyfriend. Some people argued that it was obviously rape because she said no, even if she proceeded to make out with him and didn't physically try to stop him. There was even some debate about whether the young woman had gone to the room looking for Berkowitz in the first place, and there was some debate about whether or not they engaged in oral sex meant that it couldn't be rape, because people had a hard time wrapping their head around the idea that people could be engaging in oral sex non-consensually, and I find that really interesting because there was a case, not a case, it happened while I was in college at Ohio University. I remember there was a girl on Court Street. They video recorded a guy going down on her and it was viral everywhere. And she said that, she was drunk and she was drunk. It was not consensual, it was rape. The campus was torn over that. Like, there was no ability to process that, because I guess how people perceive oral sex, or you're being pleasured or something, you know what I mean, that it could be rape. And I'm mentioning that specifically because I think that's something interesting for us to chew on and unpack in this discussion of rape culture. Anyway, what stood out to me about this debate and has always stuck with me isn't what conclusions people arrived at. It's the fact that even many of us who thought it was rape, or at least some kind of sexually inappropriate behavior, still understood how there could be confusion in the mind of Berkowitz and others, because so many of our sexual experiences and practices mirror these kinds of blurred lines. So much of this is normalized, and this is what rape culture actually is. Because as insane as it should sound to reasonable minds that we have to debate whether it was rape because of XYZ reason, even though a woman said no, it's a reflection of so many of our sexual experiences. I can think back to so many of my own experiences as a young woman where I wanted to have sex but didn't feel comfortable just exploring my sexuality or desiring sex in fear of being judged or slut-shamed, so it felt necessary for it to seem like the boy's idea or at his request or insistence, where it was part of the process for me to be convinced or reasoned with to do anything sexual. How many young boys and men are taught that they're basically supposed to talk women into having sex, to cajole them, to manipulate them, to wear them down, to run game? How many men are taught that this is what game is? Young boys are basically raised to be on a quest to try to get as many women to sleep with them as possible, but sex isn't portrayed as something women want just as much as men, or voluntarily engage in because we want to. Sex, virginity, it's all taught as something that's taken from girls and women. Think of men's coming of age movies like the American Pie films, or even the movies for older men like Wedding Crashers, or any of Barney's hijinks and How I Met Your Mother. Shoots, Barney and Ted. Or even cartoons like Pepe Le Pew and Johnny Bravo.
Say, baby, how's about you and I?
Out my way, mister.
It's all about how boys and men can trick women into sex. And our media mirrors real life, where girls are taught to be ashamed of or hide sexual desires, where we're taught to play coy and engage in this little song and dance where we don't or can't enthusiastically want or ask for sex, even if we want sex. So the mixed signals become part of this little song and dance we play. And that, my friends, is the breeding ground for rape. This is what we mean when we say we live in a rape culture, that our attitudes about sex and gender foster practices that unwittingly create sexual abusers and sexual abuse victims. In rape culture, our culture, the responsibility to protect ourselves from what boys and men are being trained to do is often placed on young girls and women. Young girls are taught to protect their virginity from boys and men who want to take it. Girls and women are shamed for being manipulated by men. For buying into the game men have been trained to sell them. Young girls are expected to hide their changing bodies from boys and men who wish to objectify them. And they're shamed if they don't. They're adultified. The adultification of children, particularly Black girls, is something I believe is under-discussed in the context of rape culture. It's the reason more adults spent time criticizing and shaming a 12-year-old Blue Ivy and the appropriateness of her dress because of her changing body than they did discussing her father being accused of raping a 13-year-old girl her age. While boys and men are taught to treat the world as a sexual playground where they should accumulate as many partners as possible, not even because they truly desire sex or multiple partners, but as a means of affirming their masculinity and sense of dominance over weaker men as well as women. Young girls and women are never encouraged to explore their sexuality or sexual needs, to enthusiastically, intentionally, or vocally pursue sex. But instead, we're taught to treat sex as leverage in a negotiation for some larger kind of commitment we must want because we're women. It's never even conceived of that we could or should want to have sex for wanting to have sex sake, that we could or should have multiple sex partners. It's never conceived of that we should voluntarily be giving away sex if we're not getting something else out of it, because surely the sex in and of itself can't be what we get out of it, because boys and men aren't even being taught to see pleasing the women they sleep with as a requirement for sex. The women are just conquests. And I think a perfect illustration of everything I've discussed thus far is Aziz Ansari, which is a name you probably haven't heard of in a while because, well, where is Aziz? That's the question I recently asked a friend of mine after he crossed my mind out the blue. I wasn't sure if he'd actually disappeared from the public or if I just hadn't checked up on him recently. So I looked into it, and he really has been virtually MIA since his last Netflix comedy special, which came after he was accused by a woman of pressuring her into sexual acts. Although, since I decided to look into where he's been, he has since announced an upcoming comedy tour. Of the many men in Hollywood to be accused of some form of sexually inappropriate behavior, the Aziz Ansari allegations are particularly interesting to me because the actual story of what happened between Aziz Ansari and the woman who accused him of assault are so remnant of a lot of people's everyday sexual experiences that we haven't been taught to see as coercive, including my own. I asked earlier, how did Aziz Ansari go from wearing a Time's Up pin at the Golden Globes to support the Me Too movement to being outed as a sexual abuser himself? Well, ironically enough, him wearing that pin and the apparent contradiction of it is what propelled his accuser to speak up. Aziz Ansari's accuser was a 23-year-old Brooklyn photographer who published her own account of what happened to her in Babe.net. In her own words, this is what happened. She met Ansari at an event, and he brushed her off at first. But after he realized they both brought the same kind of camera to the event, an old model from the 80s, he was impressed. They flirted a little, he took 2 pictures of her, she snapped some of him, and then she and her date went back to the dance floor. She said it was like one of those things where you're aware of the other person all night. We would catch eyes every now and then. They ran into each other one last time, right as Grace was leaving. Her real identity is not known to us. Grace is an alias used for the story. At Ansari's suggestion, Grace put her number in his phone. When her plane landed back in New York the next day, she already had a message from him. They exchanged flirtatious banter over text for a week or so before he asked her to go out with him on Monday, September 25th. The date didn't go as planned. The night would end with Grace in an Uber home in tears, messaging her friends about how Ansari behaved. She spoke to Babe.net where she published this story. They spoke to the first friend she told about it and reviewed the messages on her phone. The day after the incident, she wrote a long text to Ansari saying, quote, "I just want to take this moment to make you aware of your behavior and how uneasy it made me." To that message, Ansari responds, "Clearly, I misread things in the moment and I am truly sorry." The mobile phone number from which his texts to her were sent matches up with his details on a searchable public register. They spoke to Grace and she said, when we met, Ansari had just won Best Actor for his Netflix show Master of None at the Golden Globes, where he declared his support for the fight against sexual assault and harassment by wearing a Time's Up pin on the red carpet. Grace said it was surreal to be meeting up with Ansari, a successful comedian and major celebrity, and she was excited for their date. Before meeting Ansari, Grace told friends and coworkers about the date and consulted her go-to group chat about what she should wear to fit the cocktail chic dress code he gave her. She settled on a tank top dress and jeans. After arriving at his apartment in Manhattan on Monday evening, they exchanged small talk and drank wine. It was white, she said. "I didn't get to choose and I prefer red, but it was white wine." Then Ansari walked her to Grand Banks, an oyster bar on board a historic wooden schooner on the Hudson River just a few blocks away. She said it was a beautiful, warm September night. They discussed NYU, comedy, and a new secret project he was working on. She said she did most of the talking. Grace said she sensed Ansari was eager for them to leave. She said when the waiter came over, he quickly asked for the check and he said, "Let's get off this boat." She recalls that there was still wine in her glass and more left in the bottle he ordered. The abruptness surprised her. He got the check and then it was bada boom, bada bing, we're out of there. They walked the 2 blocks back to his apartment building, an exclusive address on Tribeca's Franklin Street. When they walked back in, she complimented his marble countertops. According to Grace, Ansari turned the compliment into an invitation. He said something along the lines of, "How about you hop up and take a seat?" Within moments, he was kissing her. She said, "In a second, his hand was on my breast. Then he was undressing her, then he undressed himself." She remembers feeling uncomfortable at how quickly things escalated. When Ansari told her he was going to grab a condom within minutes of their first kiss, Grace voiced her hesitation explicitly. She said, "I said something like, 'Whoa, let's relax for a second, let's chill.'" She says he then resumed kissing her, briefly performed oral sex on her, and asked her to do the same thing to him. She did, but not for long. She said it was really quick. Everything was pretty much touched and done within 10 minutes of hooking up, except for actual sex. She says Ansari began making a move on her that he repeated during their encounter. The move he kept doing, she says, was taking his 2 fingers in a V shape and putting them in my throat to wet his fingers, because the moment he'd stick his fingers in my throat, he'd go straight for my vagina and try to finger me. Grace called the move the claw. Ansari also physically pulled her hand toward his penis multiple times throughout the night, from the time he first kissed her on the countertop onward. He probably moved my hand to his dick 5 to 7 times, she said. He really kept doing it after I moved it away. But the main thing was that he wouldn't let her move away from him. She compared the path they cut across his apartment to a football play. She said it was 30 minutes of me getting up and moving and him following and sticking his fingers down my throat again. It was really repetitive. It felt like a game. Throughout the course of her short time in the apartment, she said she used verbal and non-verbal cues to indicate how uncomfortable and distressed she was. She said most of my discomfort was expressed in me pulling away and mumbling. I know that my hand stopped moving at some point, she said. I stopped moving my lips and turned cold. Whether Ansari didn't notice Grace's reticence or knowingly ignored it is impossible for her to say. I know I was physically giving off cues that I wasn't interested. I don't think that was noticed at all, or if it was ignored. Ansari wanted to have sex. She said she remembered him asking again and again, "Where do you want me to f you?" while she was still seated on the countertop. She said she found the question tough to answer because she said she didn't want to f him at all. I wasn't really even thinking of that. I didn't want to be engaged in that with him, but he kept asking, so I said, "Next time." And he goes, "Oh, you mean second date?" And I go, "Oh yeah, sure." And he goes, "Well, if I poured you another glass of wine now, would it count as our second date?" He then poured her a glass and handed it to her. She excused herself to the bathroom soon after. Grace says she spent around 5 minutes in the bathroom collecting herself in the mirror and splashing herself with water. Then she went back to Ansari. He asked her if she was okay, and she said, "I said I don't want to feel forced because then I'll hate you and I'd rather not hate you." She told Babe that at first she was happy with how he reacted. He said, "Oh, of course, it's only fun if we're both having fun." The response was technically very sweet and acknowledging the fact that I was very uncomfortable. So verbally in that moment, he acknowledged that I needed to take it slow. Then he said, "Let's just chill over there on the couch." This moment is particularly significant for Grace because she thought that would be the end of the sexual encounter. Her remark about not wanting to feel forced had added a verbal component to the cue she was trying to give him about her discomfort. When she sat down on the floor next to Ansari, who sat on the couch, she thought he might rub her back or play with her hair, something to calm her down. Ansari instructed her to turn around. He sat back and pointed to his penis and motioned for me to go down on him, and I did. I think I just felt really pressured. It was literally the most unexpected thing I thought would happen at that moment because I told him I was uncomfortable. Soon he pulled her back up onto the couch. She would tell her friend via text later that night. He made out with me again and says, "Doesn't look like you hate me." Halfway into the encounter, he led her from the couch to a different part of his apartment. He said he had to show her something. Then he brought her to a large mirror, bent her over and asked her again, "Where do you want me to f you? Do you want me to f you right here?" He rammed his penis against her ass while he said it, pantomiming intercourse. She said, "I just remember looking in the mirror and seeing him behind me. He was very much caught up in the moment and I obviously very much wasn't. After he bent me over is when I stood up and said, 'No, I don't think I'm ready to do this.' And he said, 'How about we just chill, but this time with our clothes on?' They got dressed, sat side by side on the couch they'd already chilled on, and he turned on an episode of Seinfeld. She'd never seen it before. She said that's when the reality of what was going on sank in. It really hit me that I was violated. I felt really emotional all at once when we sat down there, that whole experience was actually horrible. While the TV played in the background, he kissed her again, stuck his fingers down her throat again, and moved to undo her pants. She turned away. She remembers feeling in a different mindset at that point, she said. I remember saying, 'You guys are all the same. You guys are all the same.' Ansari asked her what she meant, and when she turned to answer, she says he met her with gross, forceful kisses. After that last kiss, Grace stood up from the couch, moved back to the kitchen island where she left her phone and said she would call herself a car. He hugged her and kissed her goodbye, another aggressive kiss. When she pulled away, he finally relented and insisted he'd call her the car. He said, 'It's coming, but just tell them your name is Essence.' She said, a name he has joked about using as a pseudonym in his sitcom. She teared up in the hallway outside his place, pressing the down button on the elevator. The Uber was waiting when she left the building. He asked if she was Essence. She said yes, and then she rode back to her Brooklyn apartment. I cried the whole ride home. At that point, I felt violated. That last hour was so out of my hand. Reading Aziz Ansari's accuser's account of what she experienced really struck me because I've been her. I know many women who've been her. In fact, I've been her many times, and I think there's something especially painful, startling, and even like panic-inducing when you actually realize that you've been her, that you've had sexual experiences that weren't so consensual, where you felt situationally pressured to do something, where someone ignored your quiet protests, your pulling away, your gentle excuses to leave, so you just got it over with, and you tell yourself it was consensual, or maybe you repress the memories altogether, or you work up the strength like Aziz Ansari's accuser did, like I've done, to tell a man you didn't like what he did. that you didn't want to have sex with him, that he ignored your indications that you didn't want to do that. I've been Grace, and I understand plain as day why what Aziz Ansari did was a violation and the trauma that comes with that. And I also understand exactly how Ansari could have somehow believed what he was doing was okay. He believed it was okay because it was normal in the rape culture that we live in that constantly affirms that kind of conduct. Reading Grace's account of the night, I understood immediately that Aziz likely began that night thinking sex was the foregone conclusion, that he took her to a bar near his apartment and rushed through the date because it was just a formality in his mind, a precursor to the sex he thought was implied. I know exactly how he would have seen it as perfectly normal to immediately start trying to rush her into sex the minute they entered his home because he thought it was implied that he wants to have sex and would be getting sex if he took this young woman home. In his mind, he figured she should know that he wanted to have sex by taking her for drinks and bringing her back there. I actually could believe that he somehow believed that her many feigned attempts at getting him to slow down was just an act. I understand it because those are the norms that create the rape culture we call our dating culture. Those are the norms I've experienced as a woman dating in New York City, but it's not unique to New York City. I think, just as my class had no trouble convicting Rusk, but struggled to convict Berkowitz, I think there are many people who maybe had a much easier time condemning or seeing as monsters other men who've been accused of sexual assault, like the R. Kellys and the Bill Cosbys and the Weinsteins and the Epsteins, but might have struggled to see what Aziz Ansari did the same way, because it would change how many of us see and feel about our own sexual experiences. So many of us would be horrified to realize that we've been either Aziz or Grace, to realize that the things we thought were consensual or normal trials and tribulations of the dating world are bad. In fact, I know this because I stumbled on a New York Times op-ed by a woman refusing to see what Aziz did as sexual assault because she said it would mean that we've all been sexually assaulted. She was so close to getting it, and that's really what I want us to tackle. This video is not about trying to convince you Aziz Ansari is or isn't a monster. Quite the opposite, really. I'm trying to point out how our society unwittingly creates Azizes, even to the shock and dismay of the Azizes themselves, men who think they're against rape, that they support victims. Because in our society, rape, sexual assault, and rape culture isn't always as clear and openly evil as the monster who physically attacks you or locks your car door. It comes in the forms of boys and men who've been taught to believe they're supposed to wear you down for sex, that your nose are just a game, a song and dance you're doing for them to wear you down because you're not a sexual being who can, should, or will explicitly say you want to have sex. It comes in the form of men who think that they're entitled to have sex with you if you go out with them. It's necessary that we teach everyone, maybe even boys and men in particular, but everyone, that they need enthusiastic consent and that they should not be trying to manipulate, cajole, wear down, and finesse people into having sex with them. It's necessary, but it's not enough. We must also teach everyone that girls and women are sexual beings who can and should feel empowered to expressly want sex if they want, and that they shouldn't have to pretend not to want sex, or to be embarrassed, or to express that, or to feel compelled to do a song and dance. They shouldn't have to feel like sex is something that's taken from them or theirs to give away. We have to recognize how our sexist and gendered ideas about sex not only leave people vulnerable to being abused, it creates the abusers. We can't stop rape without understanding what rape culture is, how it functions, and how we root it out.